Good evening.
Good evening.
I see some familiar faces here tonight and a number of unfamiliar faces, so I'm honored to be here. Thank you for being here, for staying. If you're here for Mass, for staying even longer. I really am honored that you would do that. So we prayed at the Mass already, so we'll just kind of continue in that same spirit of prayer on this Feast of Our Lady. So just to Father Michael Lamy. So Father Michael Lamy, I just have to say before I introduce myself, he said that I'm a favorite professor there. I've never heard that before, so he waits till he's gone to tell me that. But he was certainly one of my favorite seminarians to be with and to teach. And Father Lamy was one of those seminarians who almost always stayed after class to ask more questions. Because this guy is hungry. He's a hungry priest. He's hungry because he wants to feed well. He knows the more he eats, the more he can feed, like a good mother, huh? So we're grateful for this man. So thank you. It was an honor to see you celebrate Mass. So blessed. You guys are blessed with this man. I know this man, so I can tell you. And also you have incredible music here. Wow. That prelude was something magnificent in honor of Our Lady. So my name is Dr. Tom Neal. Tom Neal, Dr. Tom. I asked the seminarians to call me that. And I've taught at Notre Dame Seminary in New Orleans for just about 10 years now. So my wife and 4 children and I live in Notre. We're St. Clement of Rome parishioners, although my wife is music director at St. Philip Neri. Roman Catholics, as they say. And we moved here from Iowa, so you can imagine the culture shock of going from German Iowa to everything New Orleans. We love it here. We're honored to be part of the community here in New Orleans. I know it's late, so if you're tired, I'm tired too. So if I fall asleep during my talk, I just ask someone to wake me up. Sometimes I fall asleep in my own talks. My children once described my cadence of voice as Neal Quill. It kind of puts you to sleep. Like NyQuil, okay. All right, my humor is going to get better, I promise. It doesn't go downhill from here. So I'm going to talk about the Holy Eucharist tonight, but I want to first of all acknowledge that today is a smorgasbord of Catholic feasts and celebrations. Today, of course, is the Feast of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, which I always like to say is really the Feast of Anna and Joachim. If it's a conception, it's their conception. So it's their day as well. This is their special day. My father, who's deceased now for 2 years, we had a fun, playful relationship, and every year I would call him on my birthday, and he'd always say, as he began the conversation, "You're welcome." And be sure to thank your mother, too. So today, in the Immaculate Conception, we thank Anne and Joachim for the gift of Mary that they gave us in the world. So it's the Feast of the Immaculate Conception. It's also Advent, the great season of Advent. It is also the year of the Eucharist in the Archdiocese of New Orleans, which is why I'm here speaking about the Holy Eucharist and the Mass tonight. And then today is the last day of Pope Francis's announced year of St. Joseph. So today concludes the year of St. Joseph, a perfect conclusion on the feast of his beloved wife, Mary. And so we have all of this today to feast on. But I'm going to reflect on the Eucharist. And Father Lamy gave a bit of my title, at least the original title, which was Dispelling Mass Confusion. We'll play on words there. What exactly is going on at Mass? And usually when I give that talk, it's kind of a walk through the whole Mass. But we don't have enough time. I don't want to keep you here that long tonight. So I'm just going to talk about a certain aspect of the Holy Eucharist or the Mass. What I'll call the Mass or the Eucharist as the Sacrament of Unity. You've heard the phrase, united we stand, divided we fall. That applies to nation, to church, to family, to every community. United we stand, divided we fall. And the Eucharist or the Mass is the sacrament of unity. The sacrament that is meant to both express and create or forge our unity as people, as God's children, as brothers and sisters of Jesus Christ, as his disciples. We also say that the Holy Mass or the Eucharist is the source and summit of Christian life. The source and the summit of all the power of what it means to be a Christian, to be a disciple of Christ, to be a member of Christ's body. So the Church says that the Eucharistic liturgy is the summit toward which all of the activity of the whole Church and all of us is going, and it's the source from which all of her power flows. That's a big claim for the Mass. That's big. But if there's something about God that we know from the Bible, it's that God is in the business of big. Genesis begins with the story of let there be light. Begins with the story of the creation of this cosmos, this universe. This universe. You know, the universe, the physicists, astrophysicists estimate that the diameter of the observable universe, the diameter, is 93 billion light years across. Did you hear that? And that in that universe, they estimate on the order of 200 billion trillion stars, like our sun. That's 1 plus 24 zeros. Awfully over the top, God. Awfully over the top. So imagine with the universe as immense as that, what the architect must be like. Immense. Excessive. Over the top in everything. Everything God does is over the top. From his creation of this immense universe to his redemption of us by crucifixion. The all-powerful creator of the world subjected himself to being executed by his creatures willingly to save us. Over the top. Christians are over the top. That's how they live their lives. They're excessive. Like Mary. When we were in Iowa, I remember going to Mass one time at a church we had never been to, and we were sitting in this pew, and behind us was this family, and one of the little boys in there was extremely enthusiastic at the way he responded to the responses in Mass, which isn't always the case. You know, amid the frozen chosen, here was this young boy, and his responses were loud, and they were always 2 or 3 seconds behind everyone else. So you could really hear him. And I remember after the first reading, after listening to his responses and kind of smiling, looking back, after the first reading, the lector said, "The word of the Lord," and he said, "Thanks to big God." That's what he thought they were saying. Thanks to big God. I love that. It's beautiful. And it's right. It's big. It's immense. It's over the top. Never thought of Mass before maybe as mountain climbing, the summit, or as deep sea diving down to the source. This is the Mass, or St. Augustine taught this beautifully. St. Augustine has a beautiful phrase. He says, "To fall in love with God is the greatest romance. To seek him is the greatest adventure. And to find him is the greatest human achievement." This is what the Mass is. It's all of those. It's the great romance, adventure, and achievement. All here in this humble building. The Mass, Eucharist, is the sacrament of unity. At the Last Supper, when Jesus instituted the Eucharist, instituted the Mass, at the Last Supper, Jesus said at one point in the Gospel of John, he said, "And I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself." All people to myself. And when he said, "When I be lifted up from the earth," he refers to two things. That's one of them which is about to happen shortly, which is his execution, as he's lifted up on the cross and crucified. So he's lifted up. And what does he do when he's lifted up by us? He draws all people to himself. And then he's lifted up again on the third day in the resurrection. He's lifted up, continuing to hold the wounds in his hands and his side and his feet and his body to remind us of the love he bears toward us, even in the face of our hatred, of our division. And so in his cross and in his resurrection, he's lifted up and he draws all people to himself. And at Mass, in the Eucharist, we say that what is present there on the altar is the crucifixion and resurrection all at once. The crucified Christ says every Mass, what Father Lamy said only a short time ago, "This is my body, which will be given up for you. This is my blood, which will be shed for you," the crucifixion. But yet who becomes present when that bread and wine are transformed? It's the risen Christ who was crucified for us. And what happens at Mass? He draws all people to himself here at St. Anne's, and at St. Clement's, and at St. Philip Neri, and all the other parishes, the places where Mass is celebrated. I always like to imagine having a drone really high up that can watch all of you people in the parish coming to Mass from all your different places, how the Eucharist is drawing all you people together from all your different places of life, your homes, your businesses, your work, every situation imaginable, every background imaginable, all being brought here together. And then at the end of Mass, you all go out again, back out into the world. It's a beautiful image. And in the Old Testament, if you wanted to say there's one sign that God is at work in the Old Testament over and over again, what is it? The one sign that God is at work among the Jews is when he draws scattered people together. When he heals divided people back together again. This is the work of God that is accomplished here in the Mass. And one thing that's clear from the Gospels is this. Jesus loves to bring people into close proximity that would never hang out with each other otherwise. The people that Jesus drew into his circle of 12, if you look at their little CVs, according to their backgrounds that are given there, these are people that would not like each other very much or at all, which is why they're constantly fighting with each other and he has to break up their arguments all the time in the Gospels. But that's precisely what he wants. He doesn't want a bunch of like-minded people together. He wants people as differently minded as possible, and then he will reconcile them together and teach them how to love each other, and then he'll say to the rest of the human race, this is how you do it. That's what the church is. The church is God saying to the rest of the world, this is how you do it. And so Jesus did this again and again. In Jesus, God comes down to gather together quite a motley crew. Think about it. Liars and lunatics, tax collectors and the possessed, the righteous and prostitutes, lepers, the blind and the lame, the violent and the angry, outcasts and those who cast them out, men and women, Jews, Samaritans, Gentiles, all these people who don't like each other or who hate each other or who avoid each other. He brings them all together. This is what he does. Jesus came as a doctor for the disease of humanity. What is the disease of humanity? The disease of humanity is division. Division of us from him, of us from each other, of us from the creation around us. Everything has been alienated and broken, and he comes into it to stitch it back together again. And he places himself right at the heart of the worst division of all and lets us tear him apart. And then out of that rises from the dead and brings to us the healing of his risen mercy and grace. Pope Francis famously says, Jesus did not come to found a church that is a Hyatt hotel, but that is a field hospital for the wounded, the broken, placed in the middle of war, behind enemy lines. Behind enemy lines. I don't know if you've ever heard of Dorothy Day. She's now a servant of God, Dorothy Day, on the way to canonization. Her cause for her canonization is being processed by the Archdiocese of New York, Cardinal Dolan. And one of the things that attracted the wild Marxist activist Dorothy Day to the Catholic Church back in the 1920s was what she saw when she went to a Catholic Mass. She thought it was stunning. What did she see at a Catholic Mass? As she says, she saw people of various races and ethnicities, poor and rich, abled and disabled, young and old, homeless and housed, all singing together, all repenting together, all calling on God as their common Father, and then all going up to eat Christ's body together. She said, "This is something I've never seen." And she imagined that a church that worships God like that must be a powerful force for reconciliation and unity in the larger world. If they can do that in Mass, they must be experts at it out there. I remember when I worked 30 years ago now in a home hospice that Mother Teresa had founded in 1986. I was living in D.C. at the time. It's called Gift of Peace. And it was founded by Mother Teresa to take in homeless men and women who had HIV/AIDS in the last stages of the illness and had nowhere to go die with dignity. To die with dignity, so they'd come there. So I worked there as a full-time volunteer for a stretch of time. And among the many extraordinary things that I experienced there, one of them that really stood out was this big Mass that took place at the Basilica. If you ever went to the Shrine of the Immaculate Conception in Washington, D.C., the Basilica, you could fit like 5 of these churches inside of it. It's just immense. It's gorgeous. And there was a big Mass. I can't remember the occasion or what it was, but there was a big Mass, and the Archbishop was there, and there were other bishops there, and there were priests there from all over the place, and the church was packed. And Mother Teresa's sisters went, and they brought with them the residents who could travel, the residents from the Gift of Peace who had HIV/AIDS, who could travel. Some of them were wheelchairs, others walked with walkers, etc. They all came in, and the way that they had arranged the church was that these people, the residents, sat in the front rows of the church right in front of the sanctuary. And then the sisters behind them, and then behind them was the mayor and the politicians, and all the other notables were behind them. It was stunning to see. The usual ordering of things was turned upside down, as it should be at Mass. Go back and read James chapter 2 in the book of James, and he talks about this. This is what the Eucharist does to the world. It turns everything upside down to make all things right side up. It also reminds me, just thinking about the Mass, I don't know if you remember watching St. John Paul II's funeral in 2005. I remember getting up at 2 a.m. to watch it, because of course it happened Italian time, which means I had to get up early, and I watched it, and it was so powerful. If you remember it, it was a windy day, it was extraordinary, it was very moving. But there was one moment during the Mass, you know the sign of peace, obviously you know the sign of peace. And there was a whole section in St. Peter's Square, that huge square outside St. Peter's Basilica, which is has colonnades that are like 2 gigantic arms embracing the world. That's supposed to be Mother Church, gathering in all peoples from all places around the world together as one. In one section at the Mass, in the bleachers, there were all of the representatives from all countries around the world. It was powerful. Representatives from the whole planet here for this 88-year-old man who died of Parkinson's to come to his funeral. It was very powerful. But at the sign of peace, something extraordinary happened that hit the news, I remember, the next day. And that was that the representatives from Iran and Israel at the sign of peace shook hands. And afterwards, the representative of Iran denied that it happened. And Israel affirmed that it happened. But there it is, caught on tape. Isn't it marvelous that the Mass could disorient them long enough to let them forget they were enemies just for a moment? This is what the Mass does, when it does what it does. As a friend of mine said, Jesus is called the Lion of Judah in the New Testament. The Mass lets the lion out of the cage so he can do what he does, which is tackle sin and death between those two nations, even for a moment. And Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew's Gospel, he says this: "So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled with your brother, and then come back and offer your gift, which will then be acceptable to my Father." Because the Mass is the sacrament of unity, of forgiveness, therefore, of reconciliation. This is a hard saying. The sign of peace in the Mass, by the way, says this. It's symbolic, but we got to remember what it means. The sign of peace says you cannot come to receive the sacrament until you've made peace with all. The sign of peace is not just a high five to your neighbor. It is a gesture of saying to anyone who has wronged you or to whom you have wronged that all is set aside so that peace can be, and now we can receive. That's why we have the sign of peace when we do. Iran and Israel didn't really understand it until it was too late. Marvelous. It's also interesting that at the Last Supper, Jesus reserves, in John's Gospel, he reserves his final commandment to the Last Supper. He doesn't talk about it at all in the entire Gospel. Through his 3 years of ministry, he never mentions it once. At the Last Supper, he says, "I give you a new commandment, that you love one another as I have loved you." Knowing, after hearing his retelling of the Passover story as his own body being handed over and his blood being shed, knowing what he means by love one another as I have loved you. In the face of enemies and foes, you love. It's the meaning of Eucharist. It's the power of Eucharist. Mass is dangerous because you risk Jesus bringing you face to face with those you might otherwise avoid or dislike or despise or disagree with. There's a prayer in the Mass for reconciliation, one of the many prayers we have for the Masses we celebrate. Mass for reconciliation, this prayer goes like this, I love this. "Even more," it says, "by your Spirit you move human hearts, that enemies may speak to each other again, adversaries may join hands, and peoples seek to meet together. By the working of your power it comes about, O Lord, that hatred is overcome by love, revenge gives way to forgiveness, and discord is changed to mutual respect." That's what the Mass is about. And so when you go to Mass, therefore, bring with you in here all the division in your life, the estrangements, the hurts, misunderstandings. Bring them to every Mass and hand them over. Hand them over every time. Because you can't fix it, but he can fix it. You can't heal it, but he can heal it. So during the penitential acts at the beginning of Mass, we begin by asking forgiveness for all the sins we have committed before we even begin worshiping. Immediately, bring it to that. And then at the offertory, we hand over all of our life to Christ, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Everything we have, we give to him. And we say, "Jesus, you run a great business called trash to treasure." When I was living in D.C., I went to this place in Baltimore. Went walking in Baltimore, and I found this little shop. It was called Trash to Treasure. I went inside. I'm like, "Oh, this is a curious name." I went inside, and there's all these kind of weird pieces of art all over the place. And I went over to the lady, and she sees me, and she goes, "Can I help you?" And I'm like, "Yeah, what is this?" And she goes, "Oh, this is we take people's trash, and we turn it into art. You can bring a banana peel, you can bring a rusty muffler, you can bring an old razor. We will turn it into something beautiful." And she said, "We founded this business to make a statement about the world, that nothing is ever irretrievably lost. that it can be turned into something beautiful. And this is what the Mass is. It's the trashed treasure. It's what it is. Confession is that, of course, for those who are gravely estranged. But the Mass is our daily trash to treasure. Which is why in the Our Father, right after we say, give us this day our daily bread, then the next thing we say immediately is, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Reconciliation toward unity. It's the whole point. Trash the treasure. Bring your trash to Mass. Christ is a recycler. Makes beautiful things. Beautiful things. Beautiful things. And we remember also that when we stream toward the altar at communion time to receive Jesus with great reverence and great honor and great devotion, rightly so, when we come up to consume and ingest God, which should be shocking. Yes, absolutely. Shocking. But we must remember that Jesus never comes to us alone in communion. Because everywhere Jesus is, there is his body. The church, the whole community of those that he has joined to himself. The rabble of sinners. Us. We're a rabble of sinners that he's desperately trying to make into a communion of saints. And so when we consume the sacred host, we receive the whole body with him. I like Jesus. I'm not sure about these other people around me. I'm not sure if I want them inside. But there's no detaching him. No decapitated Christ. The head is always connected to his body. St. John Chrysostom, 4th century bishop of Constantinople, now Istanbul, once said in a homily, remember when you reverently come to receive the body of Christ that you do not promptly go forth out of this church and spit out his members. Like graphic. And then he went on to say, do you want to honor Christ's body? Then do not scorn him in his nakedness, nor honor him here in the church with silken garments, while neglecting him outside where he is cold and naked. For he who said, this is my body, and made it so by his words, also said, you saw me hungry and did not feed me. And inasmuch as you did not do it for one of these, the least, you did not do it for me. End quote. Which means that reverence for the host, reverence for the Eucharist, reverence for the Mass inspires reverence for the neighbor, in whom Christ is really present, truly present. One reverence inspires the other. Mother Teresa used to make this point with her sisters. Why do we get up early in the morning and do a whole hour of Eucharistic Adoration in the morning? So we can prepare ourselves the rest of the day to discover Christ in the distressing disguise of the poor. If we can recognize him as bread, we can recognize him in them. So that's our training for the day and our preparation. Christ, the whole Christ. And what's even more magnificent to me is that in the Eucharist, this isn't just a moral commandment that says, do this, good luck. What's even more magnificent to me is in the Eucharist, we receive the energy of grace, the medicine we need to be empowered to love this way. In the Eucharist comes the very love that you need to live in a supernatural way, above nature, superhuman way. These take us outside of ourselves, our own limits and weaknesses. The Eucharist exists to take us there. That's why it's supernatural, above what is natural to us in terms of love. The Eucharist is divine food. And you can't give what you don't have. And you can't have what you don't take and eat and receive. And we do. Someone said absolutely earlier when I said how astounding it is to think that we come up and eat God, ingest God. And I like to say to people that transubstantiation, which says that the bread and wine are transformed into the body and blood of the Son of God, Jesus Christ, it's easy to accept that that happens if you accept another premise. If you accept the premise that God created this entire universe out of nothing, then God changing one thing into another is a no-brainer to accept. It just flows. He's the master of everything. So to me, it's not so shocking that God can transform the bread and wine into the body and blood of his Son. What's shocking is that he does that. That he uses his power to make himself accessible and vulnerable and ingestible as food and drink. You know, we say God is love. God is love. You could easily convert that with the words, God is food. God is drink. God is feeding and giving drink. That's love. Feed, like a mother who feeds the baby when she nurses with her own body and blood, so to speak. With herself. At cost to herself. I remember when my wife was pregnant with our first son. Denise knows my first son, who now is a very old son, tall son, smart aleck son. Michael, I love him dearly. When she found out she was pregnant with him, our first pregnancy, she was at the doctor for another kind of exam, and the doctor said to her, we're going to do this x-ray because of this particular thing you have. I don't remember what it was. And she said, okay, are you pregnant? Patty goes, I don't think so. She goes, that's not good enough. So she gets a pregnancy test. She does it. She comes back in the room, smiling. She holds this thing up, says, you're pregnant. Oh my goodness. How exciting was that? And the next thing that Dr. Judy was her name, next thing she said, I'll never forget. And Patty came home and told me what she said after she told me she was pregnant. I fainted, got up, and then I heard the rest of the news. We were quite expecting it, but you expected it as much as you could expect it, because, can't say that. It's in the church. This is what she said. She said, okay, you got to take care of your health now, but in a new kind of way. Like, take care of your health. You can't do this, you can't drink this, you have to eat this, you have to make sure you do this. Because from now on, she said, the center of your body is that baby, and your body will sacrifice anything of yourself to keep that baby alive. If your body has to start digesting even essential organs to keep that baby alive, it will do that. It will consume you first. I thought, isn't that amazing? That written into her body is the Eucharist. Because that's what it is. To keep us alive, to feed us, he allowed himself to be consumed, destroyed for us, to give himself away, to bring us to life and bring us to birth. That's the Eucharist. It's costly food. It cost God everything. Have you ever eaten food made by someone that cost them a lot? Say you have someone who doesn't have any food of their own, really much at all, and they make you everything that they have, and then they demand that you sit down and you eat it, and they're not going to eat it because they want you to enjoy the food and not them. When you ate that, I'm sure you would eat it very slowly and with a certain kind of holy fear. And like there's no food you've ever eaten like that in your life. Mother Teresa described that in Lebanon during the Lebanese-Israeli War, and one of the orphanages was cut off, and when they finally got to the orphanage and reconnected the orphanage with supplies, she discovered that there was this Arab boy that they didn't even know who he was, but this Arab boy, every morning, the days that the orphanage was cut off from the food supplies, would run across the kind of range of fire to get food and bread and run it across to bring it to the orphanage at risk to his own life. They didn't even know who he was, but he did this every day. He could have died. And Mother, as she's telling the story, says the sisters, as they gave this food to the children, they're like, I want you to realize how much this food cost. It's the costliest food you'll ever eat in your entire life. Because this young boy risked his life every day to bring it to you. That's the Eucharist. And that's what the Eucharist teaches us to live like. Because it empowers us with that same power, that same love. The church says that the primary effect of receiving the Eucharist, what's the primary effect of receiving it? The primary effect of receiving the Eucharist is an increase in charity. Charity is a fancy theological word that says to love as Jesus Christ loved, above all else on the cross. That's charity. It's a love like no human being had ever seen before. The cross. The cross revealed a new kind of love that human beings hadn't even conceived of. That's what the Eucharist brings about in us a little bit more every day, if we permit it. As Father said, if we open like Mary to receiving Christ into our body, that's what he wants to do. To make us like that. A marvelous exchange in a strange food. St. Augustine says that it's the strangest food, the Eucharist, because in regular food, when you eat regular food, your body metabolizes that food, breaks it down, and makes the food into you. But the Eucharist is not like that. The Eucharist reverse metabolizes. When you receive the Eucharist, it breaks you down. It digests everything in you foreign to itself and makes you into it, into him. If you say yes, Lord, break me down and rebuild me like you, in your image, in your likeness. Last few thoughts. Not to be much longer. You've been very patient. Eucharistic Adoration. I love Eucharistic Adoration when the host is exposed here and we pray. Bishop Sheen, wonderful, venerable Fulton J. Sheen, used to say that Eucharistic Adoration was radiation therapy that shrinks the cancer of sin in you and shrinks the cancer of selfishness in you as you sit before his radiant presence. Because that's all he does. All he does is communicate love. All he does is communicate love because that's all he is. God is love. We don't say God is loving. We say God is love. That is his substance. That's his essence. That's his definition. That's his raison d'être. That's his reason for existing, if you might say, is to be love. For us, St. Catherine of Siena famously called God in Italian, her Umbrian dialect Italian, pazzo di amore, crazy lover. You're a pazzo, you're crazy. You're a crazy lover. She says, it seems like you're drunk with love for us. Drunk. What's wrong with you? What kind of God in dignity acts like you do? You don't need us at all, she says, and yet you act as if you could not live without us. Because you're love. You're pazzo. Crazy. And in the Eucharist, it's pazzo at its worst. At its best. Craziness. Human beings that are like that, we think they're extraordinary. Extraordinary. St. Augustine also said in a homily, he said, when you approach the altar and receive the host, before you receive, look first. And in that host, he says, behold who you are. And then become what you receive. Behold who you are. Body broken. Love spilled. And so I'm going to end with a story of a human being in my life that exemplified this for me in the most defining way possible for my life. And that was my mom, Margaret Elizabeth Neal, who died on September 6th, 2019, right here in New Orleans. 92 years old. Just a beautiful, wonderful human being. Anyone who knew her, some people here had met her. and knew her. One of the sweetest people. My mom had a very hard life, with lots of blows thrown at her, let's just say, again and again throughout her life. But one of the things that was remarkable about my mom is that as life went on, as hard as her life was continually, she became sweeter and kinder and more gentle as time went on. You can understand if someone who lives a life like that becomes hardened and bitter and angry. But it wasn't who she was, for whatever reasons. But her faith was intensely important to her. And her love for Christ was intense, beautiful. So I'll tell you the story then. My mom developed aspirational pneumonia, inhaling food one night. Nobody knew it. And early the next morning, her oxygen level was at critical level and she had almost stopped breathing. I won't go through the details of what happened, but for 9 days she went through, from that day until her death. It was a 9-day stretch. Like her last novena. She prayed novenas all the time. She was a novena fiend. Anytime you told her you had a problem, she's like, okay, got a novena. St. Jude. There wasn't one for me, hopeless cases. So my mom prayed novenas. Anyway, so her last 9 days. And they were really hard. And she lived, here in New Orleans, as I said, and my wife and I and children were very close to her. Anyway, so the last night she was conscious. It was a Wednesday night, and then Friday at 3:03 p.m., by the way. First Friday, right at the hour of mercy, right after we finished the Divine Mercy Chaplet, she literally breathed her last breath. And she would have wanted nothing else. She was a huge First Friday devotion fan, devoted to the Sacred Heart. She had an image of the Sacred Heart that she would speak to all the time. Anyway, so the Wednesday night was the last night she was conscious. She slipped into unconsciousness that night into the next day and until she died on Friday. And that Wednesday night, my 4 kids and my wife and I went to the room, her hospital room, all together to pray a rosary with her. She loved the rosary also, so we all stood around her bed. I have a picture of it. It's a beautiful, beautiful picture of her. And she, at this point, because of what had happened, was starving to death, essentially. She couldn't be given fluid, she couldn't be given intravenous nutrition or into the stomach. She couldn't be given anything. So she was just starving. And so this last night, and she would ask me every day, can I eat? Can I eat? You can't eat, Mom, you can't eat. So this last night, and she had dementia, so every time she would ask me that, then 3 minutes later she'd ask me again So last night we were praying the rosary, and then at the end of the rosary, I'll never forget it, she said, Tom, I want you to take your family out to dinner now on me. Well, you could just imagine how I would think about doing something like that. Going out to a restaurant, and here's my mom, starving. And so I look at her, she sees my face, and she knows what that face means, and she puts her hand out, she goes with her crooked finger, she goes, "This is your mother speaking." Just like that, I'll never forget. She goes, "You go." And then she said, because if you eat that dinner on me, it'll be like I had a feast. If you eat that dinner on me, it'll be like I had a feast. And so we did. I can't say we enjoyed it, but we did. We went out. And then when I came back that night, she was already unconscious, and I never spoke to her again. The last thing she said. And all I could think of, that next day I sat with her all day, and Patty, my wife, sat with her. We took turns. We sat with her all day and evening. And all I could think of was precisely what the Eucharist is. Christ at the Last Supper says, I can't eat this. This food is for you. And if you eat it, it will be like a feast for me. This is my body for you. My bloodshed for you. This is the food of love. food of unity, food of forgiveness and reconciliation. That's the food we celebrate in the Mass. That's the food he's given us. And that's why the church exists, to demonstrate to the world what the Eucharist is. May we live it. Amen. Amen. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit, as it was in the beginning, and ever shall be, world without end. Our Lady of the Immaculate Conception, Saints Anne and Joachim, in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Thank you for coming out tonight.